looking at this morning. So let's share the screen. Good. So you can see the text we're looking at, Matthew 1-17. Everyone give me a thumbs up for that one. Or say hi. Brilliant. Fantastic. Okay. Well, let's just pray. Let's give the time we've got to the Lord. So, Lord, it is really fantastic on this first time we're together to have people right the way around the world just coming together. And that as it's that verse it says in Matthew, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I'm in the midst of them. And Father, we really do encompass the ends of the earth as we're here together. And that incredible way, you're multiplied, Lord, when we're deliberate in coming together, looking to find you, to know you. And so, Father, I pray you'll bless us, you'll inspire us, you'll surprise us out of the text, and the Lord, you'll encourage us as we just take a few moments today to focus on you. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. So, I noticed a lot of people watch one of the short videos I did on the role of Matthew, and I'm not going to make a big thing of this now because I don't want it to take too long. But I always grew up from a thoroughly good evangelical position, being told probably Mark was written first, and so on. And I've changed my perspective, and just to kind of flag, that's not because I don't know enough to know better, but actually it's just that actually the cycle of evidence is shifting. So while you might hear that Mark was written first, actually that's probably about 50 years too old now as a view, although it's still quite common. And an awful lot of academics will still go with it, not because they really believe it, but because it's easier not to have an argument over something that they don't really care about. So just being kind of really blunt. Now, why is that important? Well, part of the thing is because I think it helps shape the flavor of what we read as we read through a gospel, if we understand something of the character and personality. And so we're going to see that actually as Matthew kicks off. So I'm not going to say a huge amount about him right now. But obviously we know that he is a tax collector. Mark's gospel and Luke's gospel call him Levi rather than Matthew, which is always a kind of an odd thing. Why does Levi become Matthew? Well, I know that people often have 2 names. But is there a deeper reason? Because actually an awful lot of the people who had a second name in the Gospels got given their second name for prophetic reasons or for something that happened to them. So there's always that kind of question in there. And what do we know and understand about someone who's Levi, therefore from the tribe of Levi? So he is a Levitical, he's not a priest, but he's from the support staff. He's key for being a scribe. So the scribes are from the tribe of Levi. And as a scribe from the tribe of Levi, that's actually given him the skills, which of course he's then been able to serve the Roman Empire with as a tax collector. So it's not that he's a heavy who goes around and punches someone to get their taxes from them. He's actually a reasonably senior administrative role, which requires an understanding of households, because income is taxed on households, from which we get the word economics, comes from the Greek word for household. So tax is made on households. He has to interview people. He has to make notes while he interviews them. We know this from secular documents, and not from secular documents, from historic documents. In particular, we have a whole load of material on Roman tax collecting just a province or so below Judea from the first century, from the top of Egypt, and it will be exactly the same in Egypt. So he's trained in shorthand. He's trained in interviews with people who are antagonistic. He then has to collate those notes and write reports. And so there are plenty enough scholars who've looked at it, and in the modern theories where people say we don't really know who wrote the Gospels, they'll still say, but Matthew's a really good fit for the way Matthew's written. Well, I think it really was written by him, and we'll draw some of those things out because more than perhaps any other of the Gospel writers, we see potentially how Matthew's background shapes his ability to give us the record we have of Jesus. So before I take too long on these things, I'm going to make 3 major points today. I'm saying that as a promise to you. So once I've done them, we can we can draw it together. We're going to look at the whole of this kind of the verses. I may not read them all for time's sake, but I want us to see, we're going to see in them Matthew the scribe. We're going to see, and we're going to see the way in which, of course, he frames Matthew's gospel really does sit at the head of the new covenant, what we call the New Testament. He frames that from the very opening phrase. So we're going to see Matthew the scribe, we're going to see Matthew the tax collector, and we're also going to see some interesting things which may relate to Matthew's personal testimony. And when I do that personal testimony, I am not giving you the gospel, because it's not something that's written down and you're supposed to believe as an article of faith, but it is reasonable digging on the way in which Matthew's life has probably gone, which actually help give a little bit of color as we're kind of reading through. So we'll do all of that. There are a few kind of high level things we can say about Matthew's gospel. Matthew uses the word king more than any of the other gospels. So, you know, he really does present Jesus as king. About 90% of Mark's gospel is included word for word. 90% of the words of Mark's gospel are included in Matthew's gospel. In Mark's gospel, they're delivered without interpretation, without gloss. In Matthew's gospel is full of fulfillment. So as I'm saying that, we're already beginning to see Matthew the scribe. So you can imagine, as a young man of the tribe of Levi, he's not qualified to be a priest because he's not from the priestly family, but he is from the Levitical tribe, and therefore he can train as a scribe. It's his ability to write and so on that then makes him so fit to write the gospel. The Levites were understood as the teachers of Israel. It's one of those kind of phrases. Sometimes when you're reading the Old Testament, we hear about the lights, you know, the light. They're often referred to in those ways. That might be a reference to the Levitical scribes, because they kind of nurture, they have preserved, they have restored, and they have even written the Bible as we have it. They've had their role to play. They may not be known to us by name, but they have edited even the books of Moses. We can see that the scribal inserts into those things, and so the whole of the Old Testament, as it comes together, has gone through that process. So here's Matthew, and he starts his gospel. Let's go back over here. Here we go. Oh, look at that, the way it moves. He starts his gospel, the book of Genesis, in brackets, the genealogy document. The book of Genesis of Jesus Christ. And it really is the book of Genesis. It's the same phrase. We refer to the book of Genesis is known as Genesis, and because of what in Hebrew they refer to as the Toledot formula. The phrase, these are the generations of, and so it's the book of generations. The word generations in Hebrew is Toledot. When you move to Greek, it becomes Genesis or Genesis. The Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament, has introduced the name to the book of Genesis. Now that's really significant, because you think of someone with all of his scribal training, and the whole of the Old Covenant starts with the book of Genesis, and it's going to unpack everything from there. Is going to lay out a covenant, an old covenant. And actually, the very first words of the New Testament, as Matthew is, the early church fathers tell us, is the first to write them down. And in fact, the way the Greek is worded, it sounds like he takes them down notes as Jesus does them. So in the primary gospel, and probably Matthew is working with the 12 to produce, if you like, the authorized version of the story of Jesus. And so his opening words set the whole thing out as a marker. The covenant, there's a new covenant coming, just as the old covenant was coming. We had the book of Genesis. So now this is the book of Genesis of Jesus Christ. This is Jesus's covenant with us. You see the weight of what he's driving at, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And then, of course, and so that's we're starting to see Matthew the scribe. And then, of course, he unpacks. So Abraham fathered Isaac, Isaac fathered Jacob, Jacob fathered Judah, and we get this long list that, you know, when you start reading the Bible, sometimes you try and work your way through them. When you've read it a couple of times, you start skimming through them, and we miss the story. And there's loads of things we could draw out as we kind of run through this list, which I'm not going to do for time's sake, because I wanted to keep it kind of tight. But there's an interesting kind of double moment here, because the book of Genesis is actually the phrase which you could equally translate the genealogy document, which actually also has an interesting technical kind of, which is that a lot of the largest synagogues, and certainly at the temple, held genealogy documents. The genealogy documents in Israel have become massively, massively important ever since the days of the exile, because when people came back from the exile, they often couldn't establish their genealogy. And particularly if you were a Levite, you lost the ability to serve in the temple because you couldn't prove your genealogy. And he's going to lay out a genealogy, and there's some slightly unusual things in it. But to understand that this is really pertinent for Levites, because a lot of them lost it if they didn't keep it. But secondly, as a tax collector, he would use these things to establish genealogy documents, to establish the scope of household activity, you see. So we understand that so-and-so is a part of this household, and we're taxing his whole household. And that makes sense. You don't want to basically kind of tax someone twice. So if you're taxing on households and they're making income, but they've already paid it because they're part of this household, you need to know that. So as a tax collector, he's probably someone who has access to those things. He knows where to go to get them. And probably he is actually reproducing here for us something that actually is a proper document. He's starting by saying, the first thing I'm going to tell you is I'm going to give you the genealogy document for Jesus the Christ. But he frames it by declaring it in a way that actually means he declares this as now the book of Genesis of Jesus Christ. So the kind of there's a double meaning in this first verse, which kind of suit his agenda, both as a Levitical scribe and also as a tax collector in the mix. And the reason why I say he's not just kind of gone and researched it, but he's actually saying this is the document, is because he seems to be fascinated. And this is a point that was observed over 100 years ago by a scholar by the name of Goodspeed, Edgar J. Goodspeed. I always want to call him J. Edgar Hoover, but he's not. He's Edgar J. Goodspeed, who kind of identified that actually there is a way in which Matthew writes is he's surprised when he spots things. And because some of you will be aware, if you trace through the names, there are some names missing. If you go back to the Old Testament and you trace the genealogies, there's some generations missing. And in the Western mindset goes, aha, mistake, contradiction, da, da, da. But actually they're imposing on the text something that isn't true of it, which is that genealogies were important, even if they weren't written down in the ancient world. And they're part of the reason. If you remember, for instance, when Jacob goes and meets his uncle Laban, how do you establish when you've never met someone whether you are who you say you are? And part of the reason is you're able to recite your genealogies. So in non-written pastoral context, right the way through until 100 or so years ago, remembering your genealogy was very key. But it's very difficult to remember long genealogies. So what you tend to do is you drop insignificant names. So for different reasons, you will often filter out insignificant names and you'll just head up with the key names. So you can tend to keep genealogies like the ones in the book of Genesis. We'll stick with 10 names. So we'll remember this list of 10 names. And as he looks at the official genealogy document, Matthew notices, it breaks into 3 sets of 14. Isn't that interesting? Now, why is 14 interesting? So he spells it out as you run through. If I jump down, he kind of sums it up at the end where he says, so all the generations from Abraham to David, 14 generations. And from David until the deportation of Babylon, 14 generations. Then from the deportation to Babylon to the Christ, 14 generations. Now, just to notice this, and again, Matthew's being slightly disingenuous, but he's probably enthusiastic about this. The reason I say he's slightly disingenuous is because he counts David twice. So Abraham to David, 14 generations, including Abraham and David. And then from David down to the deportation, 14 generations. Although when we get to the deportations, there's some names missing. Well, that's okay that they're missing because there's good reason why they're missing. One of the names that's missing was the most evil king that Israel has ever had. And one of the things that the temple would do is would write people out of their history. you just don't want to remember them. So they would be dropped. So not because he was insignificant, but because he was evil, he's been dropped from the official documentation because no one wants to be reminded that they went back to King Jehoiakim, you see. And so he gets down to there. And so that's not quite 14, really. You could say it's only 13 because we've already counted David, but he doesn't. So he's being a little bit, but actually that's very much in line with tax collector habits when we're summing things up. And you'll find that they will regularly group things into fixed numbers. Now, it's not normally the number 14. It's more normally 12 and 6. They will often group things as 12s and 6s, but you find that actually that was one of the ways they kept tally, was by blocking them into these significant numbers. Now, the number 14 would have been of interest because the ancient Jewish world recognized that it's the name David enumerates to the number 14. And so you can see as he's gone through the document, oh, this is interesting. You can break this up. These significant moments in Israel's history, Abraham to David, 14 generations, then David to the deportation, 14 generations, then the significant from deportation to the return, to the return, 14 generations, and then down to Jesus, 14, you see. So he's seeing there's a significant number. It's related to the name David. So Jesus becomes the head of the fourth set of 14, or if you want to think of it like this, the seventh group of 7. So he's painted a picture. He said, this is the beginning of the covenant, the book of Genesis. Here is the document. I've got the official document. And what's really interesting, you can see something of God's order and plan in this, because you can see 14s emerging just in the way the documentation is put together. Even though we know there's a few generations missing, but he's enthusiastic about this. There are 3. There's a run of 3 kings, I think, who aren't there, but it's actually it says, I think is it in Ezekiel where it says, write this man down childless. That probably is part of his punishment, is 3 generations have been dropped from his genealogy. But so he runs through this list, we could go through the whole list, but I'm not going to. Don't worry. There's also something else which you'll regularly see people comment on, and perhaps this is where I'm going to finish, and I won't spend most time because it's most unlikely, well, it is totally unlikely you will have ever seen this before, because I've never actually shared it before, and it's something I've worked out so myself, and I probably won't deliver it very well, but it's often been commented on the fact that he comments on the unusual women, and we don't know why, and they said, well, it's probably he just wants to kind of set things up. So when he sets up, and that's true, when he sets up Mary as a virgin, he's pointing out the fact that God's used some unusual situations in the past. That makes sense. But I think there's something it just struck me, and part of this came about because I asked that question, why is Levi known as Matthew? And some of you will know, if you've listened to some of the other things I've taught on this, how I suspect it's because the name Matthew appears in the Old Testament. It's Matithiyahu is the full name, and the Yahoo bit becomes Matthew bit, which sometimes it's just Matithia, but it's actually the full name is Matithiyahu. And there's a Matithia or Matithiyahu we find occurs 4 times in the Old Testament. 2 of them are in the time of David, and they're probably the same person, but you can't be 100%. And 2 of them exist from Ezra to Nehemiah, and they're probably the same person. In fact, I'm pretty sure they are the same person because it lists everybody who comes back, and it's always a person who's in the tribe of Levi. They're a Levitical priest, someone who is a Levitical scribe with the name Matithia. And interestingly, as I've touched on this before, so it's not my point today, I'm going to show you the other point today. It's Matithia who stands alongside Nehemiah in the reading of the Bible, the Old Testament, as the Old Testament is being finished and being read to everybody. So Matithia is the scribe immediately to his right, I think, or is it to his left? He's the first one named. He's the lead scribe in actually turning the old Jewish scripts into what we now call the Old Testament. The Old Testament as we have it comes from that period. So here is a guy called Levi, who strangely is also known as Matthew. But actually Jesus gives nicknames to all of his disciples, if you notice it. You're Simon, which means to listen, but I'm going to call you the Rock. James and John, you're like the sons of thunder because you make things happen. You know, Thomas, we'll call you the twin. Okay, you know, nicknames are are pretty common, and they often contain something, if you like, prophetic or related to the person. But what's really interesting, if that is the case, that Matthew is perhaps a name that is given to him because of his role as the chief scribe of Jesus, just as Matithia in the Old Testament seemed to be the chief scribe of Ezra and then Nehemiah in the producing of the Old Testament. If that is why he's got given that name, Matthew, that priest who's called Matthew also has a slightly messy divorce story or family background, if I can put it that way, which might explain why he's got a thing about how God's used people who've got slightly messed up family life, if that makes sense. Because actually the name Matthew first appears in the list of priests who have married foreign wives, and who Ezra is really annoyed with. So here is Ezra. He has a right old go at them because they've married foreign wives, and comes up with a solution, which the Bible doesn't say is God's solution, because actually it questions it later, where he says you need to divorce them. See, so Ezra comes and says you got to divorce them, and then we get the book of Malachi. See, Malachi is written at the same time as this is all going on. So there are all these priests, one of whom's name is Matthew, and who we're going to then meet again 10 years later in the book of Nehemiah, as standing alongside Nehemiah as the scripture is being finished and being read out. And that Matthew has got a foreign wife, and Ezra is saying you've got to divorce them. Then along comes Malachi and says God hates divorce, and you unfaithful people, you've abandoned the wives of your youth. And very pious religious commentaries will say, it's obviously talking about when they were younger, they married Jewish girls, and then they divorced the Jewish girls. The problem with that perspective is we never hear anything about them divorcing Jewish girls. The only thing we ever hear about them is these foreign wives who they divorced. And Malachi is saying you abandoned them and you abandoned their children. Now that doesn't mean to say that what you've got is a messy situation. They shouldn't have done what they've done. And Matthew is despised as a tax collector. He was a Levite. He had every privilege, and yet he's now sold out to a Gentile power. If you think of it like that. Is it possible? And I raise it as, is it possible it's because he has a Gentile wife? It's always a possibility. Whether he has or hasn't, the point is he's definitely someone who's been compromised by their association with the nations that are now there in Galilee. So he used to be a scribe. And you read the chapter in Ezra, it's the last chapter of Ezra, and it starts by addressing and speaking directly to Levi, and says, Levi, it's actually talking to the whole tribe. It said, when you were young, you were so enthusiastic for me. But now as you get older, this won't happen. This happened. Sold out to the foreign nations. And that could be Matthew's story. His name is Levi. Maybe he was, as a young man, he was really enthusiastic as a scribe. And at some point he sold out to the Roman Empire. Whether he married someone or not, I don't know. But you see the tie-in. Actually, that passage in where he's mentioned in Ezra, and then Ezra finishes, and Matthew's name is there about 2 verses before the end. And along comes Malachi and said, when you divorce them, but then you've abandoned them, and that's not good. And so and that's the context of those famous verses from Malachi, where it says he'll turn the hearts of the fathers to look again to the children. It's a very real, concrete issue that's being dealt with, which is we shouldn't have married these women because they were foreign and we're priests. So we're divorcing them. But now God's saying, I hate that. That's really bad. You've abandoned them and you've left them. So you need to do something about them. And I won't try and undo it now, but it seems that they did do something. So they maintain these women. In other words, it's like you divorce, but you've got to actually look after the family still. So they may not be your wife anymore, but you're still responsible for looking after them. Because when we get to Nehemiah and we read about Matithia standing next to Nehemiah, the very last chapter of Nehemiah finishes by saying, and some of them, though, they hadn't even trained those children to speak Hebrew. So in other words, those parents who divorced some time back are still maintaining each other. They're still holding things together. And he gets really annoyed about that and does the very unpastoral thing by pulling people's beards and so on. That's the way they did pastoring back in the day, which is not necessarily being endorsed. I'm just saying it's what happened. and it finishes with Nehemiah praying, saying, we're in a right old state. How do we fix this? We don't know how to fix it. But here's the key thing, coming back to Malachi. So Malachi stands as a type of John the Baptist. His Malachi actually means my messenger. And Isaiah had prophesied my messenger some years before, and then Malachi had come and he's doing it. And then John the Baptist comes and is the fulfillment of really what Malachi was all about. And it's under John the Baptist that Jesus first meets Matthew, according to Luke's gospel. So presumably Matthew, who was sold out at some point to a foreign power, by using the skills which he had out of his spiritual life, his skills as a scribe, as an administrator, his skills with money, he's taken those skills which were originally developed for God, but now he's sold out to a foreign power with them. Maybe feels a bit like the character of Levi as it's presented in Ezra. He's had it turned around. John the Baptist comes, and Malachi is a response to that mess that has been made. And so perhaps Matthew has gone down and sat under John the Baptist ministry and he repented and so on. And it's in that context that Luke says that the disciples in the book of Acts that have been with him since the days of John the Baptist. So although we don't read about it, we know Matthew has met Jesus at that period. And that would probably explain a little bit why Matthew is interested in these messed up family situations. And actually it's of interest to him. It's not just true of Jesus, but actually God has a history of taking people who've made such a mess of it and actually redeemed those things and taken their skills and done something incredibly powerful with it. And so, you know the people that are in there. There's Tamar, Tamar, whose father-in-law produces a child through her. And then there's Ruth, and she was a foreigner, but it was okay with Ruth. God did something there. And then there was Bathsheba. He doesn't even name Bathsheba, but he says he's Uriah's wife and so on. And so he introduces these women, which certainly give a context for when Jesus comes, which we'll look at next time. But also, of course, very significantly, they perhaps talk, I think, to him. So that's my these are my thoughts into the mix. And then what I just wanted to kind of share as an application is that incredible way. I think there's nobody quite like Matthew in my view, although it's not explicit, but as I've tried to think through his backstory, who is such a wonderful example of God using their secular skills and redeeming their secular history for the sake of the kingdom. And that's my part of my hope and my encouragement is that we all have a calling, and not always is that about service in church, but actually we work in our different workplaces, and actually the Lord always wants to use those things that we have developed, sometimes in rebellion, sometimes in submission, but however we've got them, he wants to turn them and produce an incredible testimony from them that becomes part of how he writes his kind of covenant. So those are my thoughts on the text, and I just wanted to kind of open up to if anyone wants to make any comments or ask any questions. I know I've done it at rather a rush.
Yes, Kristen, if I can jump in. Thinking in my teaching role, you sometimes see kids make a mess of things, and you're looking at alternate ways of getting them to have a good outcome. And sometimes you succeed, sometimes maybe you don't know, perhaps 20, 30 years down the line, something will come together. But what you witness in a classroom and in a school situation is almost like being like God looking at us in the world classroom. And that just occurred to me that, when we make a mess of things, he could still make a good pudding out of a mess. He can make an eaten mess out of it. And I'm just very grateful for that, because the number of times I mess up over the years, and I'm thinking, how on earth did you make something decent out of me? And I'm just very grateful for it.
I think it's fantastically true, Stephen. I in the Supernatural Life book I wrote some years back, I used the model of broken glass being turned into a stained glass window. And it needs the light to shine through it to really get the glory. But actually, those broken bits, it's not that somehow they're made back the way they were, but they're put together in a new way. And I think that is that for me is one of the most powerful reasons why I'm still a Christian, because you see the way God does it time and time again, as he takes people who've made the most big mess of everything, or have had a mess made of them because of stuff that happens to them, and somehow he puts them together again in a way that is a constant testimony, time and time again, different cultures, different locations, different time periods, but consistently that same work of him pulling life together and making it fruitful. If anyone else has noticed that or observed that, but
Chris, just a question about the historical context. So there would have been other movements at the time which came to nothing. Was it that every movement there would have been a scribe writing what was happening about anything that was happening? Or do you think Jesus would have said to Matthew, because he'd called him on that basis, right from the start, I want you to write down all that happens while you're with me?
Yeah.
Could you open that up a little?
Yeah, I think we'll cover it when we do the call of Matthew. I think if you look at when Jesus calls Matthew, he refers to when he's not going to be there, which Matthew is invisible in his gospel most of the time. If you think about where does Matthew appear, he appears in Matthew's gospel when Jesus calls him. He, which is a big chunk, has actually got more text for calling of Matthew than the four fishermen put together. Stop and think about that for a second. The call of Matthew is described over more text, and then he disappears, and we don't read him about in the book of Acts. We don't read about anything about him, but the early church says he was the scribe. And whether Jesus specifically asked him from the beginning or whether it was natural to him, it's now widely kind of understood that the old school where they said Jewish learners didn't write down notes is not true. It's particularly not true of those of what they call Hellenized Jews, who've been strongly influenced by Greek culture, where note-taking and so on is common. But even what we now know as the way that the oral tradition, as we call it, has come together is we find that people did have notes. They just don't get them all collated. So Matthew would probably bring that instinct. And I suspect that there's some reference in the conversation with Jesus, but he's not recorded it because he does seem to be quite deprecating. He's a scribe, not the focus of the attention. So you have to kind of read between the lines. And one of the things to notice is that he refers to Jesus when Jesus is not there anymore in the context of how Jesus calls him. So it's about, remember, it's the context of the bride and the bridegroom, and they'll celebrate while he's here, but when he's gone, then they'll mourn. So in that context, we want something to go beyond now. So I do think that's probably the case. You can't prove it. But it's, as you're trying to feel your way into these characters, it makes sense. It's a backstory that makes logical sense of what we can say historically about him.
Thank you.
And I love the way, personally, I love the fact that there's a deliberate, as a scribe, he would know totally what he's doing when he says the book of Genesis of Jesus Christ, is he's setting down something which is a new testimony, which is the foundation, if you like, of the new covenant. He's introducing for us. Any other quick thoughts or questions that anyone would like to ask? Now, what I'll do is, because we've run slightly over what I said, I'm gonna stop the stream, so where are we? How do I stop the stream? Disable annotation, meeting recording, stop live stream. So I'm going to stop the live stream, but we'll stay online for a bit, and I just want us to be able to pray for each other, if that's okay. So I will stop this now. So I'll say goodbye to anyone who's watching on